Please be seated.
Can we have document 155, please? Brother Brendan, this is a character reference that you provided in July of 1996 in relation to CCK. Can you remember who CCK is?
I do.
Thank you. And this was in relation to his first criminal proceedings and conviction, and that at that time CCK had been charged with 8 counts of indecent assault involving 5 different boys. Do you remember that?
Yep.
If I could just take you down, please, to the 3rd paragraph. At the start of the 3rd paragraph, you say this: CCK was always regarded by staff and parents, and to the best of my knowledge by students, as beyond reproach in the ways he dealt with any and all of them. Did you have any hesitation in giving that description in circumstances where you knew that at least 5 boys alleged that CCK had indecently assaulted them?
Not at that time.
Right. Why not? Sorry, I'll withdraw that. I take it from you emphasising not at that time that you might have become uncomfortable about it later. Is that fair?
I certainly would not write this reference today.
Why is that?
Because subsequent events, trials and admissions have painted a very, very different picture.
But at this time you knew at least 5 boys were alleging that CCK had indecently assaulted them. That's fair?
And I was aware of the outcome of those trials.
Yes. But were you not at least becoming concerned that while you... But were you not at least becoming... CCK was very far from beyond reproach?
I can only write on the basis of what I was aware of, and that's what I did.
Right. Thank you. Can we have, please... sorry, before we come to it, before we come to the document. In 1995, can we have, please... sorry, before we come to it, before...
Brother Dowland.
Brother Dowland, yes.
In 1995, yes.
And did you have responsibility for coordinating the lawyers and others who were assisting Brother Dowland in responding to that criminal complaint?
In a very general sort of sense.
Well, you were a point of contact for the solicitors?
I was a point of contact for them, yes.
You reported back up the line to the provincial
That's
about
correct.
those matters?
That's correct.
But you had a degree of responsibility for them?
Say that again, please.
You had an element of responsibility for coordinating, but you had a degree of responsibility for them?
Say that again, please.
140. Do you remember who Glynis McKnight is?
I remember the sort of organisation that she represented or was part of.
Right, and she was... McKnight is?
I remember the sort of organisation that she represented. I remember that she was appointed by solicitors.
What was her role in things?
I remember that she was...
Right. Did you approve of her engagement by the solicitors?
No. I approved of the funding of the operation that the solicitors undertook through her.
She provided this report in April of 1995 to the solicitors. Now, just before I take you to the content of the report, the solicitors were acting on behalf of Brother Dowland, is that right?
Yes.
But they were paid for by Christian Brothers?
The solicitors' fees were paid by the Christian Brothers.
Thank you. And that included paying Miss McNade's fees?
Yes, they did.
And did they take instructions from the Christian Brothers via you as well as from Brother Dowland?
Not in terms of any legal strategy.
Miss McNade provided this report on her investigations in April of 1995. Do you remember her report being passed on to you?
No, I don't.
I'll just take you to some of the contents and see if you remember being told about the outcome of her investigations.
I'm not saying it wasn't passed on, I'm just saying I don't remember that.
Yes, I appreciate that. She describes towards the bottom, or just starting rather at the top of the letter, she says, "This investigation to date has been a very long and involved one with quite a deal of slanderers and no information given due to the nature of the investigation and, more importantly, the fact that we were working for Brother Ted Dowland." She indicates that she contacted the police to try to gain information as to the addresses or telephone numbers of the alleged victims, and the police wouldn't provide that. It indicates that she contacted the police to try to gain information as to the addresses or telephone numbers of the alleged certain victims. And just coming over to the second page, she describes meeting one of these victims at, it seems, his address, explaining that they were there acting on behalf of the solicitors for Brother Dowland and that they wished to have an interview with him. And towards the bottom of the page it says, "He followed our agent to the car and became visibly upset. He asked, among other things, how we found him, and it was explained that our agent had previously had dealings with his mother over the last few years. And then at the bottom of the page it says, "He then told me he was attending a shrink, his words, for all the problems that Brother Ted Dowland had caused him. I agreed that it was a very difficult situation, and he said that he didn't think he could discuss the matter. At this stage he was crying and wiped his eyes with his shirt. He was very agitated." There's then some more detail given about things that this particular victim said, and just towards the bottom of the next page, point 0199, Miss McNade said, "The person himself is a very nervous, excitable type who will reduce to tears and bad language very easily. As a witness, his credibility can be very easily destroyed, as he has had enormous emotional problems all his life with his mother and her subsequent husbands, which total 3 as far as we are aware." And a great deal of the next section has been redacted, but a similar conclusion was reached about a different person. Just at the bottom of the next page, "I think the above is a fair indication of what something is about, and she would be very easily torn apart in the witness box." Going over to page point 0203, the investigator explains that a gentleman called Blair Smith, do you remember him as the police officer who was in charge of the investigation?
Vaguely, yes.
Mr. Blair Smith had contacted her and told her not to go near any of the witnesses, that the investigator was not to interview any of the alleged victims, that in fact she was perverting the course of justice. Now, were these matters and the conclusions of the investigator that I've taken you to reported to you?
I suspect so.
Do you remember having any discussion with the solicitors about whether you approved of the private investigator's activities?
As I mentioned a few moments back, the strategy was a legal strategy that they adopted. I might add by way of comment, though, that in relation to this, and I think there was one other instance of the use of private investigators, that I did come to the view that their activity was intrusive in a way that I considered, having become aware after receiving such reports, was potentially quite injurious to victims and other people in the community, and was such that I was very uncomfortable with, and that it's interesting that even without my instructions, which in one sense were a little bit beyond me because it was a legal strategy, the solicitors ceased by way of a strategy of their own in time. I was not happy in time with the way that survivors, victims, seem to be put under stress by this process. And here I would like to say to any who are present who were subjected to undue stress in this respect, that I'm sorry that such a strategy was adopted, even though I wasn't the source initially of instruction that should take place.
Thank you. So is it your evidence that an investigator was used in this matter in 1995 and in one other matter?
Yes.
But that was the extent of it?
Yep.
Thank you, Brother Brendan. Nothing further, Your Honour.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I have some.
Anyone else?
I do, Your Honour.
Yes, I do. Mr. Gray, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do.
All right, who should go first?
Commission, please. Mr. Brandon, my name is Hanscom. I appear here for 7 victims of clerical abuse. 6 of them
Just bring
victims.
that microphone across, Ms. Hanscom.
6 of them victims.
I'm a little bit deaf, so I appreciate the phone.
Shall I start again?
Yes, please.
My name is Hanscom.
Yes.
I appear for 7 victims of abuse. 6 of them victims of members of your order. So that's who I am. I'd like to ask you a few questions that arise out of the evidence you've given counsel assisting.
Thank you.
You were a headmaster yourself for 13 years, correct?
That's correct.
72. You were a headmaster yourself. To me, if not to the Commission, they may already know what reporting obligations you had, if any, to the Provincial Council of your order.
Can I clarify the question, please?
Yes. You were a headmaster of schools conducted by your order.
Yes.
The governing body of your order is the provincial, who is assisted by the Provincial Council. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What governance role, who is assisted by the Provincial Council? Is that correct?
That's
of a school conducted by your order. Is that a clear question?
It's a fair question. It's probably better to limit it to the second of those periods, in that the first was in Tasmania. The governance structure was a little bit different.
Is Tasmania not part of St Patrick's Province?
It is, but school ownership was different.
Okay, limit it to Victoria.
If I limit it to Victoria, the college that I was the headmaster of, the responsibilities that I had were to manage, to conduct the college in appropriate educational terms, according to the charism of our founder, according to the law of the state and the country, according to current and emerging educational principles according to what was fair and just and appropriate for every student, and according to any sort of internal regulations or emerging trends that the Provincial Council would put in front of us from time to time. There was reference yesterday, you might recall, to a booklet called Teacher in School that set out some norms about corporal punishment and things like that. So that was all part of the regimen of the day.
And that booklet was produced by the provincial, was it?
It was produced by the provincial leadership.
And other governance documents as to how you should conduct your school were produced by the provincial?
Not a lot. They were general guidance documents. The way schools were to be conducted was a much broader thing than our congregation. It was part of the educational forum of...
Yes, I understand that. You had curriculum requirements and examination requirements. I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you about the governance relationship between your role as headmaster and the provincial of the province.
Well, I think you need to ask me very specific questions. I've given you a broad-based sort of response.
Did you have any reporting obligations to the provincial as to how the conduct of the school was going?
That was probably provided by way of the provincial or one of his team visiting the school. That was probably provided by way of over time. There was also what I might call an educational audit taken place. So that list, we would record, for example, a list of all the teachers and their qualifications and that sort of thing. That was purely a record of what was happening, and there'd be a financial, their qualifications and that sort of thing. That was purely a record, be a report of that sort that would be provided to the leadership team.
Let's park finance to one side. Do I take it from that answer that there were no formal requirements on you as a headmaster to report to the provincial, as the governing body of your order, how the school was being conducted? Is that correct?
Not absolutely, in that the Provincial Council determined, not absolutely, in that the middle 80s, to establish what were called advisory boards and to have a nominated representative on those advisory boards. So there was a vehicle for the Provincial Council to be informed in terms of the governance at the local level of schools.
The advisory board was like a school council?
In terms of the governance at the local level of schools.
Could it impose policies on the school?
It could help establish policies.
So it could advise you, but it was up to you what the policies were, is that right?
That's true, but I would say we worked collaboratively.
I'm sure you did. I'm just trying to work out who had what authority.
The headmaster of a school at that time had a lot of authority.
Okay. And do I take it from your previous answers there was no formalised system of you making regular reports back to the provincial as to the conduct of the school? Is that correct?
There were no reports that took place that I can recall in writing, if that's what you mean by a report.
I mean what you mean. Whatever you're telling me about reports, what reports, if any, were you obliged to make to the provincial?
Reports took place on an annual basis, generally as part of the visitation process, because I was subject to visitation as the headmaster of the school. The visitor would inquire what was happening, the visitor would come and be about the school, the visitor would see what was going on, he would know what the spirit of the school was, would know whether there were kids stuck in the corridors or what was happening.
Okay, so that means, I think, that the only documentary trail we will see of any such reporting back are these visitation reports. There won't be anything else.
There may not be much else.
Right. And that means, doesn't it, in turn, that what went back to the Provincial and the Provincial Council by way of information was very largely in the control of the headmaster?
And whatever verbal report might have been conveyed to by the visitor.
Okay. You gave some answers to Councillor Assisting as to what complaints may have been made about Brother Dowling in particular, but I think your answer applies more generally to miscreant brothers. And you said, oh, well, those complaints were not formalised complaints. Do you remember those answers?
I remember the comment and the questions.
And what you meant by formalised complaints was a complaint in writing to the provincial or the provincial council. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that means, does it, that if a parent, not knowing the governance structure of the Christian Brothers Order, nor the relation between the provincial and the school, made a complaint to a teacher or a complaint to the headmaster, unless that teacher or headmaster wrote the complaint out for the provincial council, there would not have been a complaint in your terms, a formalised complaint. Complaint out for the provincial council, there would not have been a complaint in your terms.
So that may possibly be true.
So that meant, didn't it, in turn, that if a parent was worried about what had happened to his or her son, if that parent was to have any confidence the complaint would get to the head of your order, they would have to understand those relationships within the order and formalise the complaint in the way you've described. Correct?
Can you put that to me again, please?
I can. Mum or dad is worried about what's happened to their son. Clear?
Yep.
In order to be sure that the head of the order, the governing body of the school, will be made aware of their concern, they have to know the internal power structure of the order and that they should make a written complaint to the provincial. To be sure it gets there, they have to know that, don't they?
That would certainly be the safest part.
Before it gets there, they have to know that, don't they?
That, if you were talking about the situation that I was in, that if a formal complaint was documented and came to me, it would have found its way to the provincial.
I accept that, but that again demonstrates my point, that it's entirely within the discretion of the headmaster where that complaint ultimately winds up.
Yeah, I accept your point.
That's correct, is it not?
Yes.
And there was no formal system for reporting headmaster where that complaint ultimately winds up.
Yeah, I accept your point.
That's correct, is it not?
To your question, and I accept your proposition.
It's correct, isn't it?
That we have to assume that it took time for such structures to evolve. I did mention to you that somewhere in the early to mid-80s was the start of advisory governing bodies, and those governing bodies developed over time and started to have their own sort of in-servicing and training and principles of operation overseen by a provincial council. So I would think that over, let's say, 5 years, the sort of issues that you're addressing in your questions would have been addressed, and the problems, and I accept them as problems, that you're highlighting would have been addressed as well.
Those problems, as you put it, were entirely capable of solution by proper systems. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
And those systems, there was no magic in the 80s. Those systems could have been there in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, couldn't they?
I don't disagree.
And we know that tens of boys were abused in that period, don't we?
Not so sure about the 50s.
We know that tens of boys were abused over those three decades, don't we?
Yes.
And they could have been saved by such systems. We know that tens of boys were abused over those three decades, don't we?
Yes.
And they could have been saved by such systems.
We would all have been a lot better off had we had that wisdom at that time.
Mr Norton was the principal and he left office in, I don't mean principal, provincial, sorry. He left office in 1984, correct?
Yes.
And he destroyed his records, correct?
What, sorry?
He destroyed his records as he left office, correct?
I understand that to be the case.
Did the order have any systems for the preservation of records?
It did. What I'm doing is trying to find the year.
I'm sorry?
In pausing, I am just trying to find the year when we established.
Take as long as you need.
Yes, there is. I'm trying to find the year when Brother Norton, at the end of his term as provincial, said, I don't wish to keep these records. I think they're personal records in relation to an individual, and that in one sense they're his property. Now, whether you like to buy that or not is another matter, but there came a time when Brother Norton determined at the end of his first period as provincial that wasn't appropriate to do that, and that it was necessary and appropriate to set up a proper archival system. And he did go about setting up a proper archival system, and he built archives, and he employed, employ's not quite the right word, he appointed Brother Kelty, former Superior General and Provincial, to manage those archives, and they were well set up. So they were actually set up in the second period where Brother Norton was the Provincial.
When was that?
That was 78 to 84.
And yet when he left office as provincial, he destroyed records. You say that's because you understand he considered them to be personal records.
I can't. I'm indicating that at the end of his period in 78,
Yes.
he did not pass on. He did not retain personal records from that time. What he retained at the end of 84, I'm not sure, but I know that he did set up archives in that second period.
Do you know what he considered to be personal records, which he destroyed?
I don't know that answer.
You don't know that?
No.
You've been involved in professional standards management for over 2 decades, correct?
I have.
What's your role in professional standards? Your CV just says professional standards management.
I was involved, it varied over time.
Right.
In the first instance, I was involved in the legal side of professional standards and the financial side of professional standards. Professional standards has always been, and still is, under the direct authority of the province leadership team. Province leadership team is responsible for professional standards. The legwork in professional standards is done by other people. It was done by me in the first instance, and up till 2007, that was St Patrick's Province, and the legwork in terms of civil cases, in terms of towards healing processes, all of that was in my court. Beyond 2007, I was the Executive Officer for Professional Standards for Oceania, so that covered all of Australia and a bit beyond. At the end of 2014, I retired from that position, and since then I've been assisting in the Professional Standards Office.
Okay. Back at the beginning, in '93, the beginning of your involvement in professional standards, were there policies in relation to the retention of documents from schools?
That was a matter for the Provincial Council.
That was for the Provincial Council. It's not a professional standards issue.
No.
Okay. Do you know if the Provincial Council had such policies?
I'm not sure of that.
Well, you were a member of the Provincial Council from May '84 to May '96. That's 12 years.
Yes.
In the course of those 12 years, did you become aware whether there were policies for the retention of records?
I'm not sure about policies, but I think records were kept. I think the practice operated. I'm not sure about policies, but I think records were kept. I think the practice...
Policies.
Well, I'm only recalling what I can remember.
Okay. Just while we're on the topic of you as a person involved in professional standards, can I digress a little bit? You were involved in claims management, weren't you?
Sorry?
You were involved in claims management.
Yes.
And indeed, until recently,
Yep.
you were involved in claims management.
I'm still involved in a way, yes.
The experience of management.
Yes.
And indeed, until recently,
Yep.
you were involved in claims management.
I'm still involved in a way, yes.
The experience of several of my clients is that their claims were unduly prolonged and that settlement was very difficult to achieve in any sort of reasonable time, and that they found that re-traumatising. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm happy to comment on it.
Are you aware that complainants had that experience?
I'd like to just say this about that. When we started into trying to address the claims issue, it was difficult for us to know just how to deal with claims. The field was new to us. I didn't come having done a degree in claims management or professional standards and this sort of thing. None of us had. It didn't exist. So when we started to try and respond to people who made claims, we came pretty much as novices to this field. So to try and respond to people who made claims, we came pretty much as novices to this field. So I'm quite prepared to acknowledge that our initial efforts to respond may have been deficient, and I would like to feel that what we've done since those early days is to respond in much better and much fairer and more appropriate ways to claims that have been made. And to anybody used to it or didn't know how to do it best at the outset, I would simply like to apologise in relation to that. And I do that here now in this room. To do it best at the outset, I would simply like to apologise in relation to that. And I do that here now in this room. But I'd also say that beyond those stumbling steps, basically, as we can do it today, claims are often controlled by lots of factors outside of us. For example, the legal representation of claimants and the processes that those people want to take the claim through. They might be controlled by all sorts of other factors as well. So I think it's not just a one circumstance situation that we're addressing in this. But I do want to add the comment that I've made that if something has been messed up somewhere along the line, and it was through our fault early on particularly, then I am sorry about that. And I would like anybody here who's been affected by that to know what I'm saying about that.
You accept, though, that people may well have been re-traumatised and suffer further psychiatric harm if their claim was unduly prolonged?
Oh, undoubtedly.
You accept that?
Of course.
Can I turn to another topic, but still related to harm if their claim was unduly prolonged?
Oh, undoubtedly.
You accept that?
Of course.
Both a member of the Provincial Council and involved in professional standards management, although I must say I'm unclear about your actual title, back in July 1994, when mandatory reporting in Victoria first came in for teachers and principals. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, in general terms, yes.
In very general terms. So when mandatory reporting came in, you were only aware of that in very general terms.
Well, one of the things that I've struggled with over time is the changes that have occurred in mandatory reporting over different sort of scenarios. For example, at the moment we deal with all of Australia, and there's a different requirement in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland and everything else. So
now just hang on a minute.
So it's a complex story.
You were a member of the Provincial Council of St Patrick's Province, not all over Australia, Victoria and Tasmania.
At that time.
In that time.
Yes, sure.
Mandatory reporting for teachers and school principals became law in Victoria on the 18th of July 1994.
I'm prepared to accept that.
Thank you. What did you do about it? What did you do to tell your schools, you now have a new set of legal obligations, here is what you should do?
I'm not sure, as you asked me sitting here now, what I did to tell the schools, except that the schools would have been well informed by sources outside of our office and outside of the Provincial Council.
That is to say,
but I do suspect that it was drawn to the attention of schools by our leadership team in any event.
When you say by people outside our office, you mean by the State Education Department?
Yes, but I suspect that wasn't the only source of information to the schools. I suspect that we drew it to their attention as well.
But you would regard that primarily, since it was an act of the Victorian Parliament applying to all schools, you would regard that primarily as an education.
To their attention as well.
But you would regard that primarily, since it was an act of the Victorian...
Have a professional standards office as such set up. It was a professional standards function that was being exercised by me as an individual, as a member of the leadership team.
I see. So when your CV says you are professional standards management, it doesn't say manager, you mean there was just one person, that was you?
That was right at that time.
For 22 years?
Well,
23 now.
Well, that's not quite. It's correct that it was management, but it's not quite correct that it was.
Now.
Well, that's not quite. It's correct that it was management.
Can I turn to another topic? You were asked about what the Provincial did in response to complaints regarding Dowland. You'll recall Can I turn to another topic? You were asked about what the Provincial did And the word you used was assiduous. The provincial was assiduous in his interaction with Dowland to find out what had happened. What did he do? When you gave that evidence before lunch, what did you mean? With Dowland to find out what had happened. What did he do?
I said that he was assiduous in the way he went about it.
What inquiries had he made?
I said that he was assiduous, the sort of person who didn't leave any stone unturned in the way he went about exercising his role.
Now
That's being assiduous.
That says he's an assiduous person. This is the sort of person he is. I'm asking you what he did about these events.
I don't know what he did.
You don't know?
In personal terms, in terms of Dowland.
You don't know what inquiries he made?
No, I described the person in those words.
So when you said he was assiduous in his interaction with Dowland to find out, what you meant was, I know he would have been because he was that sort of person.
Yes.
Were you here yesterday when... No, before I turn to that topic, can we stay with that for a minute? At transcript 16038, you said, in response to some questions from the... I turn to that topic, can we stay with that for a minute? At transcript 16038, you said was innuendo regarding sexual interference. Do you remember that series of questions from the presiding commissioner?
Can you put that to me again, please? It was remarkable.
It was a remarkable issue that there was innuendo around of sexual interference with children. You were asked a series of questions by Justice McClelland about that. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you gave this answer to one of those questions, as best I could take it down. It was unusual. More commonly, these things are dealt with one-to-one by the provincial, away from the visitation forum.
Right.
These things are more commonly dealt with one-to-one. How frequent an occurrence was such an event? How frequent was it that such reports were coming to the Provincial Council? That you give the answer, more commonly, these things were dealt with one-to-one by the Provincial. That you give the answer, more commonly, these things were dealt with one-to-one by...
General answer. And when I say these things, they may not be things purely of... not very often, is my general answer. A judge to be such, the provincial and the individual ought to sit down together and work out what needs to be done. So these things may not be limited to sexual indiscretions or whatever words we want to use to describe them. But in terms of frequency, might be half a dozen in a year or something.
I didn't hear that. The pen was...
Maybe half a dozen.
Half a dozen a year.
Perhaps, but I'm not saying that they relate to sexual indiscretions as such. Might be half a dozen occasions in a year out of visitation of 40 communities across a province where something crops up that requires a provincial to sit down one-to-one. Communities across a province where something crops up that requires a provincial to sit down one-to-one with somebody and say, I need to talk with you about this.
Well...
Now, I'm just
asking you to guess at all. I'm asking you to say what your evidence meant in response to the questions from the bench.
Well, that's my best estimate.
Were you here yesterday when Mr Nangle gave his evidence?
I was here yesterday.
And you heard him enumerate 4 factors that, in his opinion, had led to the deplorable sexual abuse in Christian Brothers schools, particularly in Ballarat. Do you remember that evidence? He gave 4 factors.
I do.
And one of the factors he gave was that back then, in the 60s and 70s, people didn't realise the harm that sexual abuse did to the victims. Do you remember him saying that?
I do.
And it's a fair comment, isn't it, to say that at the time, at these reports in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s even, that you didn't think it did a lot of harm. That's right. At these reports in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s even, start with you. You didn't think it did a lot of harm. Not now, not what you know now, what you thought then.
I'm trying to recollect how often any of these considerations came across my screen in the 60s.
All right, let's leave the 60s aside. In the 70s, we've seen copious evidence that it was coming across the screen of various people in the order, including the Provincial Council.
Yes, it didn't come across my screen in the 70s. So any thoughts that I would have had on which I could make any of those sort of judgments would not have been until on which I could make any of those sort of judgments.
That's not right. What you're being asked is a general question. Whether or not you knew of individual cases, you're being asked your opinion if a child, as to the damage that might be done to a child if they were abused. Do you understand?
Yes, and I'm trying to remember.
You don't have to remember any individual case. You just have to tell us what you thought at the time.
Well, I'm trying to remember what I thought back then.
Well, then tell us that.
Well, it's difficult for me to sort of put myself back there and remember what I thought 50 years ago.
40.
Or 40. Put myself back there and remember what I thought 50 years ago. Anyway, I won't argue about how many years, but if we went back to, anyway, I won't argue about how many years, but that was a case I was involved in. If it was a case where I was the headmaster or something like that, I would be very concerned about a student and the impact on the student.
Brother, again, that's not what you're being asked.
I know. I'm trying to come to grips with that question because
it's not a very hard question. All we need to know is what you thought might be the impact upon children back then.
Yeah.
Others in the church have answered that question.
Well,
we'd like to know your answer.
That's okay for them, but I'm trying to remember what I thought about that back in the 1970s.
Maybe the answer is you didn't think about it in the 1970s.
Well, I'm suspecting there was some ambivalence.
Ambivalence. Ambivalence, you said.
I can't hear you.
Did you use the word ambivalent? Ambivalence. Ambivalence, you said.
On children then, and that there was a certain amount of focus on some sort of care for the brother who had offended, if it was a brother. But I wouldn't say there was zero concern about children. So I'd say it was at, but I would say there wasn't a primary concern on children in the 70s.
I think that's true. And in fact, the case is something like this, isn't it? Being a member of a religious order, as Commissioner Murray put to you, is like being a member of an extended family. Correct?
Well, there's some similarity.
You are of an extended family. Correct?
Well, that's...
In many ways, you're probably closer to your fellow brothers than to many members of your biological family, for many brothers.
There's some truth in that.
And many people who go into such orders are seeking that kind of close support and relationship, are they not?
Not so sure about that. You're going into motives there.
And what they expect from their order in return is support.
Well, they certainly expect that.
Yes?
Yes.
And you are, of course, right. The focus in the 70s, perhaps even the 80s, was how can we help our brother who has fallen? That was the focus, wasn't it?
There was certainly a significant focus in that direction.
It was the primary focus.
There was a significant focus in that direction.
And that focus, how can we help our fallen brother, was much, much more important than what might this have done to that child? He'll get over it. Isn't that right?
There was a fair bit of that at that time.
Yes. Yes. The Commission, please.
Mr. Second. I have no question, John. Thank you, Your Honour. Brother Brandon.
The Commission, please.
Mr. Second. I have no question, John.
Thank you. My name's Shaw. I appear for two survivors, Mr. Andrew Collins and Mr. Stephen Woods, both of whom suffered abuse at the hands of Christian brothers, amongst others.
Yep.
All right.
You need to make sure you're being picked up by that microphone.
My apologies, Your Honour. All right, can you hear me?
Only just,
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, that's better.
All right, I want to ask you some questions about Glynis McNate.
About?
Glynis McNate.
Yes.
Now you know who that is. Glynis McNate, as we've heard, was in effect a private investigator. Is that right?
Yep.
Now, you, on behalf of the Brotherhood, engaged solicitors Doyle Considine, is that right?
Yes, although the solicitors operated for Ted Dowland or for other parties.
Yes, so Ted Dowland had been charged with some criminal offences, is that right? Is that right? Ted Dowland had been charged with some criminal offences?
Yes.
The Christian Brothers, in effect, paid for his legal expenses.
That's correct.
And they engaged a firm of solicitors in Geelong called Doyle Considine.
Yep.
You were the person who dealt with them on behalf of the Christian Brothers.
Yes.
You were the one who provided them with instructions.
Depends what you mean by that.
Well, there's a lot of lawyers in this room, and it's well understood that a lawyer can't do anything without his or her client's instructions.
Yes.
Your role was to provide instructions, and it's well understood that a lawyer can't do anything without his or her client.
Of strategy or anything like that.
Well, let's start with the bigger picture. We'll start with the general and move to the particular, shall we? All right. Your role was to provide instructions to Doyle Considine solicitors.
Understood in a broad sense.
Yep. Of all the people in the Christian Brothers, that was your task to deal with the solicitors.
Put that way, the answer is yes.
Yes. And if they said, look, we'd like to do a particular thing, they would have to ask you first.
Put that way, the answer is yes.
Yes. And if they said, look, we'd like...
This is what we're going to do. It's going to cost this much.
Are you suggesting that a solicitor would go and do something for a client without getting instructions to do so?
Well, they really said, this is what we want to do, this is what it will cost.
And you said, yes, go and do it.
I said, if that's what it will cost, then we are prepared to pay for that.
Which therefore means you said, yes, I instruct you on behalf of the Christian Brothers, who are your client, to go and do it. Is that right?
Well, I said we would pay for that.
What's the difference?
I said we would pay for it.
I suggest you're being evasive, Brother Brandon. You instructed the solicitors to engage Glenys McNate.
You can put it that way, but I'm just telling you what happened.
Well, let's explore it a bit further. Tell me if this is how it came about. Doyle Considine said, we've come up with a particular legal strategy, I'm using your words. I'd like to tell you about it. And they told you about it. Is that right?
Well, they didn't tell me much about it.
Sorry?
They did not tell me very much about it.
Well, what did they tell you?
I said we'd like to explore what this means. We'd like to investigate this matter.
Yes. And you no doubt said, how do you propose to do that? Or words to that effect? Yes?
Perhaps. I don't know though I said that.
Are you seriously suggesting you didn't know anything about what this strategy was? You said... Are you seriously suggesting you didn't know anything about what this strategy was? You said, I'll fork over money from the Christian Brothers and you can just spend it how you like. Is that what you're saying?
I trust the legal professions.
To Doyle Considine on behalf of your order without knowing what it was going to be spent on?
I did know in a general sense what it was going to be spent on.
Well, let's talk about that then. Mr. Weigel was the man at Doyle Considine, is that right? John Weigel, is that right?
Weigel.
Weigel, John Weigel. He was the man you dealt with?
That's my memory.
He was the solicitor?
Yes.
All right, so you would have had a number of conversations with him regarding this matter?
Not many.
No.
I presume some.
Yeah, well, you're the person at the Christian Brothers who's the contact, and he's the...
Not many.
No.
I presume some.
Yeah, well, you're the person's matter, the charges against Brother Dowland, you and he would communicate.
That's logical.
Well, yes or no?
The answer is obviously yes.
Thank you. All right. He came to you at some time in 1995, in the early part of 1995, and said, I propose to engage a private investigator or an inquiry agent, to use the euphemism. Is that right?
It seems to be.
Yes or no?
It seems to be.
All right. And you said, all right, I go and do that, and yes, tell me how much it's going to cost and we'll pay.
I said we'll pay for that.
Yep, because you wanted it to happen.
I didn't hear it.
You agreed to pay for it because you wanted him to do that.
I'm sorry, I didn't pick up.
You agreed that the Christian Brothers would pay for that,
yes.
Pay Miss McNate's fees, which were several $1,000s, because you wanted your solicitors to engage her.
I wanted the solicitors to do what they thought was appropriate in the circumstances.
Yes, and they told you what they were going to do, didn't they?
Well,
They said, we're going to go and get an inquiry agent by the name of McNate to investigate this matter, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Yep. They went further, I suggest. Mr. Weigel said to you, she is going to investigate the alleged victims of these crimes. You were told that, weren't you?
I don't recall the detail of what I was told, other than that she was going to investigate the matter.
So you don't remember, but it's quite possible, isn't it, that he said, look, what she's going to investigate are the victims.
That's possible.
It's not only possible, it's exceedingly likely.
It's possible.
All right. And that's what she did, wasn't it?
It seems so.
Well, I suggest you can't have an equivocal answer about that because we've seen the report. That's what she did, wasn't it?
Well, that seems to be the case, yes.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
If we could turn now to her report. It's at tab 140, thank you. Just before we go to the document, about these tactics, is that right?
Yes.
When was that?
It was after having received a report.
All right, so this report's 24th of April 1995. I assume you received it shortly thereafter. Is that right?
I presume so.
How long after you received it did you decide you didn't like these tactics?
Probably fairly soon.
What do you mean, a couple of days or a few weeks or what?
Oh, both of those would be fairly soon in my estimation.
All right, well, best you can. How long after you received this report did you think to yourself, I don't approve of what we're doing here?
Well, within a couple of weeks I would have said I'm uncomfortable.
To whom did you say that?
I would have said it to myself in the first instance.
And then, having told yourself that, did you tell anyone else?
I probably shared it with the leadership team.
Did you speak to the solicitor about it?
I don't know.
It's pretty important, isn't it? Whether you did or you didn't.
Yeah, I accept that, but I don't know the answer to your question.
All right. Turning now to the report. You've read this report, haven't you?
Of course.
You read it at the time, 1995,
Yes, of course.
and you've read it, no doubt, in the last couple of days.
Well, recently anyway.
Yeah, in preparation for this Royal Commission. Yep.
Yes.
It is quite clear that Mrs. McNate has tried to track down the people who were abused by Brother Dowland. Is that right?
It seems to be the case.
And that was the legal tactic that was to be employed, was to track the people who were abused by Brother Dowland. Is that right?
It seems to be the case.
And
At
that...
the outset,
All right, I'll ask you an open-ended question. What did you think they were going to do? These investigators, these solicitors, what were they going to do? You're paying $7,000 for this. What were they going to do?
I presumed that they would have at least investigated who the people were and what their circumstances were. I didn't actually imagine they were going to front up to the door and knock on the door and say, can I come in and talk to you and sit in your dining room and be confrontational or anything of that sort.
You would have found out soon enough who the victims were when the police delivered the brief of evidence, wouldn't you?
I didn't hear you, Jim.
You would have found out soon enough who the victims were when the brief of evidence was served on Brother Dowland.
I'm not arguing about any of that.
Well, what I'm getting at is,
You asked me a question.
why would you spend $7,000 to find out some information you were going to find out for free very soon?
I'm not going to argue about that.
That was a question. What's the answer?
I'm simply responding to the initiative of the solicitors and their strategy and their recommendation, and that's what I did.
All right, so their recommendation, you say, was we're going to find out who these victims are and where they live.
And generally what's going on.
What do you mean by that? What's going on?
That was the suggestion of the solicitors as to their endeavour to find out whether there was what the total agenda was in terms of these claims being brought.
What do you mean an agenda?
Well, their words, not mine.
As what?
Their words, not mine.
Right. And when you say claims, what do you mean? Isn't this about the criminal charges against Brother Dowland?
Well, they are, sorry, a mistake on my part, they are criminal charges, yes.
So there's no claims?
Criminal charges.
Yeah,
I take back the word claim.
All right. So you've instructed the solicitors...
The defence of the criminal charges.
Yeah, you've instructed the solicitors to act as criminal defence lawyers for Brother Dallin. You've instructed the solicitors...
The defence of the criminal charges.
Yeah, you've instructed the solicitors, and the idea was we need to find out who these alleged victims are. That's right, you wanted to know that.
Yeah.
And rather than wait for...
I didn't want to know that. The solicitors wanted to know that.
Well, the knowledge is not much use to them unless they pass it on to you, is it? You're the client.
I'm not the client. Ted Dallin's the client.
Yes, but you, on his behalf, are liaising with the solicitors.
Ted Dallin's the client. They're acting for Ted Dallin. They're running the defence. I'm not doing any of those things.
You're just signing the cheques, eh?
Yep.
Right. However, they did tell you what they were going to do. They were going to go and investigate, didn't they? They told you they were going to investigate.
Yes.
Did they also ring Ted Dallin and tell him what they were going to do? Do you know if they were liaising with him?
I don't know the detail of that.
Or was it more likely they'd talk to you because you were paying the bills?
Well, that's supposition, but that's probable.
All right. Once you read this report, you realised, if you didn't know already, that the investigator was trying to find out whether these complainants would be good witnesses. Is that right?
That's certainly an element of the report.
On page 3, so point 0199, please. At the bottom of that page, there's a name redacted, which I assume is one of the complainants. Redacted himself as a very nervous, excitable type who will reduce to tears and bad language very easily. As a witness, his credibility can be very easily destroyed, as he has had enormous emotional problems all his life with his mother and her subsequent husbands, which total 3 as far as we are aware. Now, clearly what has happened there is, which total 3 as far as we are aware. Now, assessed whether he will be a credible witness in the Brother Dallin criminal matter. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that was information that was very valuable to the Christian Brothers, wasn't it?
It's very valuable to the solicitors representing Ted Dallin.
That's right, because if the witness isn't credible, it's more likely that he will be acquitted of these charges. Is that right?
That, I presume, is what the solicitors representing Ted Dallin would have judged.
And when you read this, that passage I've just referred to, did you immediately ring the solicitor and say, well, I think that's inappropriate what you're doing?
I don't recall doing that, but I was...
Passage I've just referred to, did you immediately ring the solicitor and say, well, I think that's inappropriate what you're doing? All right, so your evidence is basically you didn't think that the investigation would take this path?
That's true.
That it wouldn't be so intrusive?
And I've already said that in this room.
The investigator also made some inquiries into the Broken Rights group.
I'm aware of that.
The investigator also made...
I think it was early days.
1995. What was your view at the time?
Yeah, well, as I said, it was early days, and I think that I didn't have any particular early days, and I think that.
Why would you have?
But
why would you have?
I'm just answering your question, and but there was within certain elements of the community a feeling that Broken Rights had a particular agenda that was, let's say, anti-church or anti-church authorities.
With good reason, one might have thought, brother.
And that That made, I think, some of the legal firms representing church parties a bit suspicious of broken rights and their means of operating. It wasn't my suggestion at all that broken rights be part of this story. That was an initiative taken by solicitors and...
All right, well, let's leave that for a moment, but just on broken rights, what was the feeling in the church about broken rights? What were you saying? Back in those days, 1995?
I'm not generalising about the church. I just said that there may have been some bodies...
In the church about broken rights? What were you saying? Back in those days, 1995?
I'm not generalising. Some church bodies and their approach to, or their response to claims of abuse.
Well, of course they were.
All right.
That was their raison d'etre, wasn't it?
Okay, so given that, I think these solicitors thought that they ought to get a little bit of a feel for where broken rights stood in this particular case.
And the investigator came back with this comment. This is on point 0206. Thank you. Fourth paragraph. The broken rights group appeared to be very secretive. Now, when you read that, what did you take from that?
I wouldn't take anything particularly from it.
All right. Well, you're paying good money for this information. What did you do with it?
I just note the comment.
Sorry?
I just note the comment, that's all.
Pot calling the kettle black, wasn't it?
Sorry?
It was the pot calling the kettle black, wasn't it, brother? The broken rights was secretive.
Well, I'm just noting the comment in the report, that's all.
Well, what do you think of that suggestion that the church itself was exceedingly secretive at this time about these matters?
In respect of the comment about broken rights, I note what it says.
Now, you've said that having read this, you were not happy, I'm paraphrasing what you said, about some of these tactics that had been used.
And I stand by that.
All right. All right, so you got the report's dated 24th of April, so it was sent to you on or about that date. Yes?
Yep.
Along with Miss McNate's... Oh, no, sorry, the bill went to Doyle Considine on that day. And the bill was for $5,320. That's at .007. Doyle Considine on that day. And the bill was for $5,320.
I note that.
And then the report and the bill was sent to you on the 26th of April, so 2 days later. So that's 141, tab 141. So there's the bill. Then if we go to the next page, 142, we have, if you like, the covering letter, and that's addressed to you. Now, no doubt you agree, you received that letter and you read it?
Yep.
Yes?
I see the letter.
You received the letter at the time?
I presume so.
And you read it at the time and you've no doubt read it since.
I presume so.
All right. It says at paragraph...
I presume so.
And then they ask you for payment, and then it is noted that our investigator's preliminary report has been received, and they ask you for payment, and then it is noted that our investigator to be the first of several reports, wasn't it?
this report.
Well, it's called a preliminary report, that's all.
Well,
So I suggest that when the lawyer from Doyle Considine spoke to you, he told you, look, there may have to be a number of reports.
I forget the detail of that now,
But that would suggest that that was the case.
yes, or this might have been a draft or something. But anyway, yes.
All right. Next paragraph says, what is not contained in the report, as clearly as it might seem, is the link between Slater and Gordon, broken rights and the alleged victims. At present, there is merely hearsay evidence in respect of such link, although such hearsay is apparently from reliable sources. Inquiries are continuing with a view to positively identifying the links, as well as the link Blair Smith has with the organisation and the alleged victims. So it would appear at that point that more work is going to be done by the investigator. Is that right?
Well, it seems so.
And you're being told about that?
Well, it seems so.
All right. Now, the first thing I want to ask about that is, what is the problem with there being a link between a firm of solicitors, a victims advocacy group and the victims themselves? What's wrong with that?
I'm not saying there's a problem.
Well, it's suggested there's a problem.
I'm not saying there's a problem.
Did your lawyer say what the problem was?
I don't recall that.
You would agree, though, this letter suggests that that, for some reason, is something that needs to be investigated.
Well, it's the lawyers who are running the strategy, not me.
If you wanted them to stop running that strategy, you could have told them and they would have stopped.
That's probably right.
And you didn't tell them to stop.
I didn't tell them to stop.
The investigation continued
That's true.
into very personal details about the alleged victims.
I've acknowledged that already.
Yes, into this purported link between a reputable firm of solicitors, a victims advocacy group, and people who've been abused by Christian Brothers. The purported link between a reputable firm of solicitors, a victims advocacy, is because you wanted to dig up some dirt on the victims, didn't you?
I didn't.
The Brotherhood did, didn't they?
No.
So you're just spending $6,000 on nothing, is that right?
And well, in the long run, I acknowledge that it was what I would call a waste of money. I've acknowledged that.
May well have been a waste of money, but it caused a lot of harm, didn't it?
And I've acknowledged that earlier this afternoon.
So when, as best you can remember, did you call this investigation off? Because it was your call, wasn't it?
In one sense, it wasn't called off by my saying finito. It was called off in one sense by, I think, the realisation of all the parties that this was a futile, called off in one sense by, I think, the realisation of the solicitors acting, in this case, Doyle Considine, and if they hadn't taken that initiative, it would have been us.
Ted Dowland didn't get any say in any of this, did he?
Ted Dowland wasn't really able to comprehend what was going on.
That wasn't why he had no say in it. The Christian Brothers were paying his legal fees and they ran the show. That's what happened, isn't it?
Solicitors ran the show, the Christian Brothers funded it.
And instructed them.
I didn't instruct them to take on this.
Ted Dowland didn't instruct them, did he?
Ted Dowland wasn't part of the picture.
Like I say. Now, at the last paragraph on that page, Brother Brandon, it says this: we also confirm funding has been... Now, at the last paragraph on that page, Brother Brandon, disbursements. Now, you approved that funding, didn't you?
Yes.
Did you do that on the phone with Mr. Weigel?
I don't realise I don't remember what the mechanism was for that.
But he's clearly said, look, we need another $5,000, and you said, yes, I approve that expenditure.
Yeah, by some means, yes.
All right, so at that point you're happy for the legal tactics, as you call them, to continue?
Oh, obviously.
Yeah. And they did continue.
Oh, obviously.
Yeah.
Partly because they were not getting anywhere, and it would have petered out further because I wouldn't have supported it any further.
When you say they were not getting anywhere, what would you have considered to be getting somewhere?
I can't answer that because...
Well, you said they weren't getting anywhere. What do you mean by that?
I don't think any report can answer that because...
Well, you said they weren't getting anywhere. What do you mean by that?
Other than what I regarded as hurtful sort of information and...
Well, what were you hoping for?
I wasn't hoping for anything.
Well, what sort of information do you think you were going to receive?
I don't know the answer to that. I wasn't the source of inspiration for this strategy at all. That was a legal strategy. They were the people deciding that.
Well, I suggest you're being disingenuous, Brother Brandon. You must have known what sort of information you were trying to obtain. You must have.
That wasn't...
You honestly saying on your oath you had no idea what sort of information you are paying the lawyers to obtain? Are you saying that to this commission?
I'm sorry, that wasn't...
You honestly saying on your oath you had no idea what sort of information you are paying? Now, the investigator not only spoke to the victims, but members of the victims' families, didn't she?
It seems that's to whom they spoke.
She spoke to one of my client's mothers. Is that right?
Sorry again.
She went and spoke to one of my client's mothers.
It seems that's what happened.
What did you think about that?
Well, I've already expressed my view about that.
Were you concerned, perhaps, that the investigator might do something illegal?
Might do something?
Illegal?
No, I wasn't, because the investigator was being controlled by the solicitors. That was their domain. How they ran that show was their business. I didn't engage the investigator.
All right. Well, could you tell the Commission how this petered out, this investigation into the lives, personalities, families, history of the victims of the abuse? This investigation into the lives, personalities...
I think it petered out in the sense that the solicitors didn't see any return.
They didn't see
any return for their efforts to explore this avenue of information gathering.
All right. Now, I don't want to labour the point too much, but what was the information that you wanted that was going to be of use to you and to Brother Dallin?
That was a matter of judgment for the solicitors. We're talking about legal strategy. That's not my court.
All right, let's call a spade here. What you wanted to do...
Not what I wanted to do.
What your lawyers wanted to do, what the Christian Brothers lawyers wanted to do...
What the lawyers for Ted Dowland wanted to do.
All right, well, I can see you're wiping your hands of this, but anyway, what the lawyers wanted to do, whoever they were doing it for, was to dig up as much dirt on the victims as they could. Is that right?
I'm not prepared to say that.
You've read the report.
What I'm prepared to say is that they wanted to investigate the background of the people that are referred to in this report as thoroughly as they could to see if there was any information in there that they might use in the defence of the case, the claim, the charges that Ted Dowland was facing.
Now, if you think about it, what's the only useful information that they could find? And that is bad things about these people.
Maybe. I'm not in a position to judge that. Again, we're getting into the legal debate, and I'm not competent to make those judgments. This was the forum of the solicitors who were running this case, and that's where it's at.
All right, so is your evidence then that really you just said to the solicitors, just do whatever you have to do, send me the bills and I'll pay them?
Yes, but I was
Is that what you said?
It wasn't an open-ended cheque.
Open-ended cheque?
It wasn't a matter of, here's the cheque, you fill in the numbers.
No. No, you were concerned that the amount of money spent would be finite, but as far as the depth to which the investigation was sink, you didn't care, did you?
The investigation was an issue for the solicitors.
Brother, you've constantly said that this was a matter for the solicitors. And it's been put to you that the brothers are paying the bill.
That was true.
You've also said Mr. Dowland was out of it. What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I didn't quite pick it
You
up.
said Brother Dowland was out of it. What did you mean by that?
I really meant, I think, that his capacity to give instruction, to comprehend the legal process was probably very difficult for him to manage.
Why was that?
For him to manage.
Why was that?
He was under a lot of strain in the light of the legal proceedings, and under a lot of strain in the light of the legal proceedings, and finding it very difficult just to cope with life at all. And I think his capacity to, I still think was probably not too far off the mark by saying what I did.
So effectively, you, on behalf of Brother Dowland, took over his defence. Is that right?
Not to the point of being able to say guilty or not guilty or anything like that.
We'll come to that in a moment. But you took over his defence. Is that right?
I wouldn't like to say that.
Well, if he wasn't capable, because you say he was not a very sophisticated person, the logical thing is you were doing it for him. The logical thing is you were doing it for him.
Exactly what that means in terms of taking over.
I don't think it's very difficult, brother. You've told us of his capacity. We know, because of the discussion we've had about your role in this, it rather looks like you were running his defence.
I was certainly coordinating things to see that he had proper legal representation, and that the solicitors were paid, etc., and that they were able to instruct barristers and that sort of thing. So if that's what we're talking about, then I accept that.
Did you ask him whether he'd committed the acts with which he was charged?
No. Well, if that's what we're talking about, then I accept that.
Did you ask him whether he'd committed the acts with which he was charged?
No. Well, I don't think so. I think that was...
What do you mean you don't think so? Did you or did you not ask him, are you guilty of what you've been charged with?
No, that was something between him and the solicitors.
Well, are we in this position that the brothers were prepared to pay money in his defence to send investigators out to investigate the lives of other victims, and they never asked Brother Dowland whether he was guilty?
I can't remember at this stage just what he might have volunteered, but I don't have any recollection of having asked him and his legal representatives. Would have been very specifically between him and his...
A defence which, in fact, had no substance, weren't you?
We were funding the defence.
Which had no substance.
Which in the long run had no substance.
And you didn't ask him whether or not it was right or proper for the brothers to fund his defence.
He may have been asked through his solicitor.
But this was a matter for the brothers. You were paying for his defence, weren't you?
Yes, but he may have been, I can't recall on the spot now, but he may well have been asked, if you like, through me, but through his solicitors, where he stood on that. I didn't sit down with him and say, now, Ted, did you do this?
Well, do you think you should have?
Sorry?
Do you think you should have?
I probably thought that that was more the prerogative of his solicitor.
But the brothers were funding the defence. They were going to put these victims through investigation and the courtroom. The brothers were responsible for that.
I accept that.
And you didn't think to ask, are you guilty?
Well, I'm trying to recall precisely what we did ask, and I honestly can't tell you that now.
Well, brother, I do think, I have to tell you, it would be rather remarkable if you had asked that question and you didn't remember doing so.
Well, it may be remarkable, I accept that.
Very well. Yes.
Thank you, Your Honour. Just checking something.
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honour. Just checking. If we turn to tab 142, please. Tail 0.0029, so the second page. This may well answer His Honour's question. The first paragraph, it says, as you well. So this is the letter that contains or enclosed the report and the bill. It says, as you may well appreciate, there are matters of a confidential nature which we cannot disclose to you and which are not contained in the report of our investigator, but which effectively disclose many of the links between matters raised by the client's instructions and the investigations. Now, I'm not going to try and interpret that rather oblique sentence, but then the next part says, we can quite openly, however, indicate that our client continues to maintain his strong denial in respect of each of the allegations raised against him, which relate to sexual molestation of any alleged victims.
Right. Okay.
Right, so as far as you were aware, he was pleading not guilty.
I understand that.
And he's telling you he didn't do it.
Sorry?
And he's telling you he didn't do it, effectively.
Well, he didn't ask him.
But you never asked him.
Well, he's making that claim strongly there, so...
Perhaps that's why you didn't ask him, because the lawyers told you that.
Well, presumably there'd been dialogue there at some point to establish that fact.
Perhaps that's why you didn't ask him, because the lawyers told you that.
Well, presumably
Your time as... I want to ask some questions about how... Now, I want to ask you some questions about your time, formal complaints and so on, and how they're processed, right? But of course, you can also have a situation where there is suspicion, innuendo and so on, which might cause you to act. Fair enough?
Yep.
All right. So, just want to ask you some questions about when you were the headmaster at St Kevin's College in Toorak.
yes.
All right. Now, while you were there in about 1983 or 1984, there was some suspicion regarding one of the resident teaching brothers, wasn't there?
About one of?
About one of the resident teaching brothers, wasn't there?
You may need to be more specific than that.
Well, I will be. There was a suspicion that a certain brother, and I'll name him if I need to, had behaved inappropriately with some of the boys. Do you remember that in 1983, 1984, thereabouts? This man wasn't charged with any offences.
Was in charge of?
Any criminal offences?
Wasn't.
No.
Right.
However, he was sent away during the school holidays, not the end of year school holidays, but one of the holidays in the middle of the year. He simply didn't come back to school for the next, sent away during the school holidays, not the end of year school holidays, but let me preface that with another question. That sort of thing didn't happen very often at St Kevin's, did it?
No, it
Under
didn't.
your watch?
No, it didn't. And therefore I'm just...
That's why you'd remember it when it did.
I'm just struggling to...
The man who got sent away was a teacher called... Do you remember him?
Oh, yes.
And that's what happened, wasn't it? Tell me if this is right.
I don't remember him being sent away, actually, but go on.
There were some... And there was complaint, and this created some suspicion that Brother Swanee was behaving inappropriately. And I won't put it any higher than that, but that was the situation, wasn't it?
Something happened.
Yeah. And so there was no formal complaint, but there was an informal complaint about this man. Yep. Yes?
Yeah. Well,
And-
yeah, we could describe it that way, yes.
Well, I have, and you've agreed with it. And in the middle of the school year, he stopped teaching at St Kevin's, didn't he?
He may have. I just forget the exact detail of that, but I'm prepared to accept your statement on that.
All right, you accept that. And he was given a job somewhere else with the Christian Brothers. Is that right? He remained a Christian brother.
No, he didn't remain a Christian brother for very long, but
Well, let's just take it one step at a time. When he left St Kevin's, he remained a Christian brother.
he was still a Christian brother.
Before this proceeds any further, there's been no notice of this. A man's name has been given in open court. I know nothing about it, but in my respectful submission, that name should not be disclosed. There's no document, there's no nothing.
That's probably right, isn't it?
There is no document, and if Brother Brandon had said no, that didn't happen, there'd be no evidence of it. But there is
The
evidence.
problem is the name.
Yes, well, I didn't want to disclose that, and I thought I would be able to do it without doing that. The name could be suppressed from here on.
I make an order that the name be suppressed and replaced with an appropriate pseudonym.
If Your Honour pleases. So this man was left St Kevin's. Is that right? Just simply, he stopped teaching there.
He left St Kevin's. I'm not sure just exactly when or how quickly or what the circumstances were, but he did leave St Kevin's.
And the reason he left was because of this, this issue, this informal complaint about inappropriate behaviour with one of the boys.
Probably.
Yep. And he remained a Christian brother for some time about inappropriate behaviour with one of the boys.
Probably.
Yep. And others.
Possibly. I don't know now.
You don't know what job he had.
No.
And then ultimately he left the Christian Brothers, is that right?
He left the Christian Brothers at some stage.
Now, I'm not doing this, I'm not going through this in any way to bring this particular man into this commission. But what I'm doing is showing that with this man, there was an informal complaint which did not lead to police charges. But that was enough for you to take action, wasn't it? And you did.
I don't know that you've got the circumstances correct, and I'm not too sure that we ought to be discussing the circumstances of this particular case. I don't know that you've got the circumstances correct, and I'm not too sure that we ought to be discussing...
An informal complaint, yes, against this man.
Sorry, eh?
You've agreed with me that there was an informal complaint in 1983 or 1984 against this man. Yes?
There was no complaint that actually came to me.
Well, the complaint was made by a parent to somebody at the school.
Well, that's a pretty broad sort of statement.
And then that complaint was eventually communicated to you at the school.
Well, that's a pretty broad sort of statement.
When you became aware of the issue, I don't want to take it any further than that.
Yeah.
You acted quite appropriately.
Yes.
You got rid of him.
We could put it that way, yes.
Well, I did, and you agreed.
Yes.
Okay, so what we see here is, even though there was only a complaint that was informal, it was second-hand, and never led to criminal charges, as far as we know, that was enough for you to act, to get this man away from the children and out of the school, wasn't it?
I could accept that.
Yes. And yet, in so many other cases, you say, oh, well, there was no formal complaint made, therefore we didn't do anything.
The difference is obvious in that I was on the spot. I had first-hand sort of experience of what was going on, and I acted on that.
And it's admirable. But the point is, you don't need a formal complaint to do something, do you?
I was close enough to the action.
There's too much at stake. The child's welfare is at stake, and if you don't act quickly, someone can get hurt really badly.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to convince me.
So that's why you acted so quickly.
Obviously.
Yeah, and without the sort of proof that would have him found guilty in a criminal court,
Yeah.
you can't wait for that sort of level of proof, can you? You just, an assertion and some innuendo and suspicion is really enough. You've got to play it safe, don't you?
I had the advantage of sort of being close enough to the scene
To believe that it was credible.
to sort of know the circumstances around it,
All right, so you brought some of your own knowledge of the situation to it.
which is quite different from something which is out there somewhere and it's hearsay, so to speak.
All right, so your position is this, that look, if you have some knowledge of your own, then a suspicion or some unsubstantiated allegations are enough for you to avoid risk and simply say, look, I have to get this brother out of here.
I was also in a position of being able to act somewhat more confrontationally
You spoke to the man.
because, yes,
Did you have to run it past any of the Christian Brothers hierarchy?
obviously I had to be in liaison with them.
Yeah. And they acted very quickly and accepted your suggestion to get him out of the school?
Oh, yes,
Within a matter of days?
it was quickly.
Sorry?
It was quickly.
It was quickly. And you'd agree now that even though the man perhaps doesn't get a trial and all of that, really that's the best way to act because that's safer for the children.
Yep.
Thank you, Brother Brent.
Thank you.
Mr Gray.
Perhaps just before Mr Gray gets to his feet, brother, can I take you back to some questions and answers? You'll recall that when we resumed after lunch, Commissioner Murray asked you some questions about the nature of the community. Resumed after lunch, Commissioner Murray asked you some questions about replicating the institution of the family. I think you accepted that proposition.
there are certainly some similarities, yes.
And I also understood that in answer to those questions about whether or not that had ever caused you to feel any conflict between your obligations as between the brothers, and I'm not sure it was put to you as specifically as this, but let me do it now. The students that came within your care as students attending Christian Brothers schools. And do I understand that your position remains that that's not a conflict that you ever felt?
I don't think there are instances that I could pinpoint where the conflict led me to act on behalf of the brothers and not to represent the interests of the students fairly. I think the example that's just been referred to illustrates to some extent that I did what I should do in respect of the interests of the students. So I think I can be absolutely certain that that's where my priority has been, and it needed to be.
Let me take you to the example before that Mr. Shaw was asking you questions about, though, with respect to the engaging of Doyle Considine in the defence of Brother Dowland. Now, I don't want to get into the murky area of who was instructing whom, but you accept that on behalf of the Christian Brothers, you were funding and assisting Brother Dowland to run his defence to criminal charges that were complaints from students of Christian Brothers schools. That were complaints from students of Christian. Does that not cause you now to reflect on whether or not you had yourself in those circumstances in a position of conflict?
I don't think so. I accept the question as a question that's important for me to reflect on and to have reflected on. Were I simply to have been making decisions on my own, there would have been a real danger of that. One of the advantages of having a council, a leadership team, was that there were other people to challenge perspectives. And the Provincial Council did from time to time seek an outside perspective on what it was doing as well, to try and see that we were, in fact, being fair and honest to everyone. There was an issue of fair and honest to everyone. Those who've been offended against and how their needs are being met, and in the broader spectrum of how monies are spent, we keep those two things in very, very different baskets.
Sorry, in very...
We keep those two things, those two financial sort of considerations in very different baskets.
All right. Let me interrupt you, though. I'm asking you now personally to reflect on the earlier answer that you gave about whether or not you potentially had yourself in a situation of conflict.
Well, I think there's always potential, but I don't think that I was conflicted.
Mr. Gray?
represent the Truth, Justice and Healing Council and, as presently relevant, the Christian Brothers and the Diocese of Ballarat. I have only, I think, 3 matters to ask you about. First is a short point. In questions from Dr. Hanscom this afternoon, there was a question which appeared to indicate that the suggestion that the professional standards management within the Christian Brothers for 22 years from 1994 was made up of just one person, namely you. To the extent that that's how the evidence came across, is that right?
Professional standards initially.
Is that right?
Complaints started in 1993 or round about that time to surface with us and to need to be addressed, and but that wasn't all day every day, and they fitted into my role, my broader role as a member of the Provincial Council, so that what I was doing there was part of that role. But over time, beyond 96, I was doing other things as province bursar and business manager, etc., and professional standards was part of that sort of role. And progressively, the need to address professional standards increased. We all know the number of claims that were being made increased over time. More attention and more detail was needed to how claims were being received, processed, and managed. But that was in my hands in terms of the legwork, the actual management on behalf of a leadership team for St Patrick's Province, all of that time until the end of the life of St Patrick's Province, which was 2007.
And did something change then in terms of the numbers of people working on?
Sorry?
Did something change then, or by then, in terms of the numbers of people working in relation to professional standards, not just you?
Yes, up till then it was basically it was me and some secretarial assistants. 2007 it was Oceania Province, and it was all of Australia and a bit more. And initially it was still just me and a little bit of assistance until we got some feel for how things were going. Along the line a little bit, a deputy joined me in that process, and in the last couple of years, as we've expanded our operation process, and in the last couple of years, as we've a very explicit decision to re-examine a lot of cases across all of Oceania. The number of settlements we're dealing with is massively increased, and our office staff has increased somewhat along with that, right to the point where last year, for example, we had 205. Last year, in the calendar year, last year we had 205 settlements across Australia. We committed over $20 million in settlement fees last year. Of those 205 settlements, Mr Shane Wall or I were physically involved in meeting victims across Australia somewhere, and so the load has increased massively, the involvement's increased massively, and the office has expanded to meet that.
And as we speak, you're now a consultant, I think, to the Professional Standards Office, is that right? as we speak, you are now a consultant to the Professional Standards Office?
We can call it that, yes. I retired as Executive Officer some 15 months ago,
Yes.
but I still work as part of the office,
Yes.
technically on a part-time basis.
And how many people are in the office who are not merely consultants but actually working on professional standards?
There are 5 who work in the main part of the office in terms of the hands-on.
And Mr. Shane Wall is the head.
Mr. Shane Wall is now the Executive Officer.
Thank you.
In the main part of the office in terms of the hands-on.
And Mr. Shane Wall, my learned friend Mr. Shaw spent quite a lot of time with you in the hour or so that he was questioning you about the Doyle-Considine letters and the investigator's report. And I just wanted to pick up a couple of things there. You said in one of your answers, perhaps more than one, that it was not the Christian brothers who were Doyle-Considine's client, it was actually Brother Dowland or former Brother Dowland who was their client. Is that right? Now, I wonder if we... Brother Dowland or former Brother Dowland who was their client. Is that right? Now, I wonder if we could have tab 142. Just wanted to pick up a couple of things as we go through this. In the third paragraph of this letter dated the 26th of April, they are enclosing, that is the solicitors are enclosing in their letter to you, a copy of the McNeat report dated 2 days earlier. See that?
The third paragraph.
Yes. They say our investigator's preliminary report has been received and we enclose a copy of such report dated the 24th of April, which is 2 days before the date of this letter.
I see that.
Say received, and we enclose a copy of such report dated the 24th of April, which is 2 days, and had not seen it before.
No.
If we scroll down to the bottom paragraph on the first page, the lawyers say to you, we also confirm funding has been approved for the investigator to continue her investigations for an additional sum of $5,000 plus disbursements. See that?
Yes.
So that funding had been approved before you had seen what it was that she had been doing so far.
Well, that's correct.
And what you are told in this paragraph is that the investigator was going to be on call at the committal proceeding and she would continue with general investigations and so on. Do you see that?
Yes, there.
And that's the first point. And the second point involves the top paragraph on the next page. Just want to go through that with you and recall it to your memory. The solicitors say to you, as you may well appreciate, there are matters of a confidential nature which we cannot disclose to you and which are not contained in the report of our investigator. You see that?
Yes.
Did that come as a surprise to you, or did you understand that that was indeed the basis on which they were operating?
Well, I understood that it was the solicitors running the show and that they were subcontracting, so to speak, to the investigator, and that's where I left it.
And they go on in that sentence, having said that there are things that are confidential that they can't disclose to you.
The investigator, and that's where I left it.
And they go on in that sentence, effectively disclose many of the links between matters, things, that is, those confidential things that they can't disclose to you, effectively disclose many of the links between matters raised by the client's instructions, and I interpolate on the one hand, and the investigations, and I interpolate, on the other hand. You see that?
Yes.
Now, does that appear to you to indicate that it was instructions from the client, namely Dowland, which led to the investigations being embarked upon?
Well, I think it does.
And then in the next sentence, continues to maintain his strong denial in respect of each of the allegations raised against him, which relate to sexual molestation of any alleged victims. You see that?
Yes.
Now, they refer to the client, that is Dowland, continuing to maintain his strong denial, i.e., is this right, a denial which he had already made clear sometime previously?
Yes.
So does that... Let me withdraw that. Did you think, either at the time of receiving this letter or at any time at this period, that you were somehow funding a defence that had no substance?
Certainly not.
If you'd asked Brother Dowland whether he'd committed the offences, would you have expected an honest answer?
Sorry.
If you'd asked Brother Dowland whether he'd committed the offence, to answer you honestly.
I think so.
Now, a different topic, brother, and a short topic. I wonder if we could have on the screen, please, the statement of BAC, which was from May last year. I wonder if a copy could be provided to Brother Brandon.
If it helps, I think the doc ID, it's BAC statement. I think the doc ID is STAT.058.6.001.0001.
It's Exhibit 28-5 in this hearing.
.058.6.001.0001.
Now, brother, I only want to take in one paragraph of this statement. This is BAC's statement, and in one section of it, starting at paragraph 37, he talks about a number of meetings which he had with various Christian brothers. And at paragraph 42, he refers to a meeting with Brother Godfrey and yourself. See that?
Yes, I do.
And then he goes on then in paragraph 43, which is the one I wanted to ask you about. Could you just read paragraph 43 to yourself? Did you say to BAC or his brother that they did not deserve this money?
No, Mr. Gray, I did not say that. My recollection of what was likely to have been said is that he and they did not deserve the treatment that had been meted out to them. I might have added that no amount of money or compensation would in fact assuage the hurt that they had sustained. I certainly did not say that they did not deserve the money that was provided to them by way of compensation.
And secondly, sorry, you finished? Yeah. Secondly, in the same paragraph, did you say to them that you did not want to hear from them again?
No. The part even prior to that about this being the end of it would have referred to the deed of release, bringing closure, legal closure, to the situation, and the statement that said that I did not want to hear from them again, I certainly did not say. I don't recall now the precise words that might have been used, but it would have been in the context of what I've just said about the deed of release, bringing closure to the matter, and my hope that in fact the whole experience was going to be one of closure.
Now finally, I just want to ask you some more general questions about what you
Perhaps I could just add one comment,
yes.
and that is that if the wrong impression has been given to BAC through that discussion, I'm very sorry about that, and I would just like that to be recorded for the sake of the record, and that if there's any misunderstanding anywhere, I'm more than happy to meet with BAC and to explore the situation further.
Thank you. Now, your CV has become an exhibit, it's 28144, but in picking out some more general propositions, from 1985 you were the bursar of the province.
Yes.
And then in 2002 your title changed from bursar to Legal Affairs and Property Development Coordinator. Just looking at the CV, that's what you've got.
I had a few hats, yes.
Yes. And just looking at the CV, that's what you've got.
I had a few hats, yes.
It was through your role as the bursar and later the Legal Affairs. It was through your role as the bursar and later began to become involved in the handling of complaints regarding child sexual abuse. Is that right?
Yes.
And when Towards Healing was introduced in 1997, you also became the contact person for Towards Healing matters in the province.
That's correct.
And once you took up the new title, or the new hat in 2002 as Coordinator of Legal Affairs, you continued to deal, in practical terms, with any complaints of child sexual abuse which came in and which were separate from Towards Healing as well. In practical terms, with any complaints of child sexual abuse which Now, I think Christian Brothers, claims against the Christian Brothers and perhaps religious institutions generally, began to take on significant dimensions in and about from the early 1990s. Is that right in your...
About 93.
Yeah. And did you, from about that time onwards, start coordinating in what was then a reasonably ad hoc way the response of the Christian Brothers to those complaints as they came in?
I think, by way of reflection, that the initial response was probably a little clinical, probably a little stilted. My response would have come out of a background at that time of business management and being bursar, finance management. It came out of the context of handling something that had financial dimensions and legal dimensions to it. And we've already addressed the issue to some extent.
Yes.
Of a warm, personal, prompt response to claims. And I do acknowledge that in the early days that mightn't have been as empathetic as I would hope people find it to be today. And I do acknowledge that. And I say to anybody who has felt underrated or not treated as nicely as they might have been, I say a word of apology in respect to that. But we were trying to come to grips with something which was new in terms of our own agenda, and not knowing exactly how to deal with that.
And in those early days,
Let's
say around about the early 90s,
early 90s, but things did change. And
did you know then, though, just in those days, in about the early 90s, very much, at least compared to what you know now, about child sexual abuse generally, about its prevalence, about its impact?
We didn't know very much about it at all, I'd have to say, honestly. We were doing our best to deal with it, and we gave energy to it. We mightn't have done it as well as we wanted to. We certainly wanted to, but we didn't have towards healing. We didn't have any of those structured responses in 1993. Towards healing only became a practical reality in 1997. So we were on our own very much for a few years. And even when that became a reality, it took some time for that to sort of become pliable and to be able to be something that could work smoothly. So I think we grew ourselves in the way that we handled things over time. And I know that I grew personally over that time.
I'll come to that if I may, but at that earlier stage, late 80s, early 90s, even mid-90s...
Over that time.
I'll come to that if I may, but in such numbers in the ranks of Christian Brothers and other religious and the clergy?
No. We were dealing with a new phenomenon, and we had a case that we've talked about here of Ted Dowland in court. We had a case of Bob Best in court. They were our only court cases in those days.
But then over time, of course, as we all know, through the mid to late 90s and then into the first decade of this century and then continuing, the numbers of complaints and the number of offenders, it became clear, was much less. Decade of this century and then continuing, the numbers of complaints and the number of
And a legal record was a list of complainants, victims, abused parties, and that's all I kept, in a way, with subsets, but abused parties, and that's all I kept. This was, and has remained really, the question of abusers, even though we spent a certain amount of money here and there and all of that, there's always been a very secondary consideration. And even last year, where we dealt with over two, there's always been a very secondary consideration. Particularly in recent times, is today and will be tomorrow our primary concern. It has to be.
Can I just ask you this before picking up that point? One consequence, there are many, but one consequence of the increase in the numbers of complaints and the numbers of offenders and of the awareness of the severity and range of the problem is that is this right, that the Christian Brothers have developed various protocols by now to regulate and dictate the way these matters are dealt with?
That's true. I was asked before about policies and protocols and so on, and it's taken time for us to get those sort of things knocked into shape. And
one of them is the protocol for the provision of legal assistance by the congregation to either Christian Brothers or former Christian Brothers in criminal matters.
Yes.
And there are guiding principles for responding to civil claims, including child sexual abuse.
Yep.
And there's a protocol for the management of Christian Brothers who have sexually abused children.
Yes.
And I haven't listed them all, but they're three of the more significant ones.
Yes.
Now, another consequence for you personally, is this right, was that you attended more and ultimately a very large number of meetings. For you personally, is this right, was that you attended...
I don't know how many facilitations or mediations I've attended, maybe 400. It's a lot in time. I would have to say honestly that that's probably the best part of what I do. Sitting down with somebody and being able to honestly interact and try and get some sort of feeling and some sort of empathy for the other party. And it actually helps me grow myself at a personal level as well, to be able to do that. So I just share that as a personal sort of insight.
And among other things, what bearing does that experience of those meetings with the people and hearing their stories have on you when it comes to the writing of an apology?
Sorry, Peter?
You mentioned the impact on you of attending these meetings and being affected by the stories that you hear. One of the tasks that you have had over the years has been to be the person who writes an apology to a victim as part of a settlement. Does your experience in those meetings play a part in how you go about the task of writing the apology?
I think it's pretty I won't say pointless, but it's far less effective to be writing apologies from outer space. If I'm present in a meeting, a mediation meeting, and I've apologised to somebody in person, they may be there with their wife or other party, and I can follow that up later in a personal sense, then that's far, far more effective, I think, and appropriate. And follow that up later in a personal sense, then that's the way it's done. That's the way we do apologies and try and make them personal.
I have one more question, but before I do, I think there may be an error in the transcript. One of your answers, where you were saying that you went on to say, last year when we dealt with over 200 claims abusers, I think you may have meant abused people.
Sorry, I correct that. Claims of people having been abused.
Yeah. I think you may have meant abused people.
Sorry, I correct that. Claims of people having been abused.
Yeah. Now, finally, brother, in particular, have you participated in many meetings with victims in connection with the Ballarat area?
I've met a lot of the victims in Ballarat. I sat through all of the hearings, Royal Commission hearings, and a lot of the victims in Ballarat. All the sessions here this time, I will be here right through to the end of this hearing. I've met a number of victims, survivors here through this hearing. Apart from the hearings, I've met many victims, survivors here through this hearing. A lot of them personally by name and other contact, and independently of the hearings here in Ballarat, I know quite a lot of them personally by name and other contact, and likewise in other states.
Been of a similar kind to the experience that you described about meetings with all the other victims over the years?
I'd say generally, it's not universally that way. There are some people who don't want to sort of interact on that level, and I understand that and respect that absolutely, but in general terms the answer is yes.
You've mentioned that you've been in court for the entirety of the Ballarat case study, that is in May last year in Ballarat, in December last year in Melbourne.
Yes.
Again,
I wasn't present all the time for December last year.
Some of the time.
Yeah.
And again this week. And you heard, apart from hearing all the evidence of all the victims, you heard the evidence of Brother Clinch last May.
Yes.
And you're aware of the apology which he extended on behalf of all the Christian brothers, the evidence of all the victims. You heard the evidence of Brother Clinch last May.
Yes.
And as a Christian brother.
I certainly endorse every word of Brother Clinch's apology.
And their families.
Yes.
And do you join in that apology yourself as a Christian brother?
I certainly endorse every word of Brother Clinch's apology, and also of the previous one by Brother Julian MacDonald in Perth, where I was present as well. So to date, and say to any and every victim that we are actually on your side. We've got to go ahead together and sort of resolve these matters, and the world is out there in front of us to be grasped in some way, and we want to help in that. And we do thank the Commission for this opportunity to be here and to say those things.
Thank you, Ron.
Brother, you told me that If you'd asked Brother Dowland whether he committed the offences, you would have expected him to give you an honest answer.
But I did expect him to,
Yeah.
yes.
That means that he would have told you that he committed the offences, doesn't it?
That he would have told me that.
If you'd asked him the question, that means he would have told you that he committed the offences.
Well, that's what it means. But,
Precisely.
and I accept your statement and an interpretation of that, but
I don't know about interpretation, but it means he would have told you that he committed the offences. Now, if you'd asked him the question and got that answer, would the brothers have funded his defence?
if he'd said, I've committed these offences, it would have been a different sort of defence, obviously, because it wouldn't have gone through the normal sort of trial process and so on. So it probably would have been funded to a certain extent, because obviously there's got to be some funding for the actual process itself. But it wouldn't. What bears on that, although it wasn't established at the time, is the document that Peter Gray has referred to about how we handle the costs of criminal trials, and the protocol that we've now put in place, and how we seek guidance, because I don't have all the answers to how to fund criminal trials. But to cut to the quick on, in terms of Ted Dowland and what might have happened back in '96, it's a hypothetical, and I don't quite know the answer to that.
So are you saying that the brothers, even if told by Dowland that he'd committed the offences, the brothers might have funded him to go to court and plead not guilty?
Not if he told us. If he told us that he'd committed the crimes, we wouldn't have funded him to go to court and plead not guilty. No, not at all.
Can I just follow that up, Your Honour, if I may? So when you referred to the process, did you mean that if he told you he was guilty, the funding would be for a plea of guilty or something of that sort?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I meant. Sorry if that wasn't clear, that's what I meant.
Before you conclude, I would like to ask you some questions, please, Brother Brandon, arising out of answers to questions from Mr. Gray, with respect to your Australia-wide responsibilities in terms of settling over 200 claims, as I understood it, against Christian brothers. To begin with, have you read the statement of Dr. Peter Evans?
No, I've only read a paragraph or two, I have to confess.
I just want to refer to one item there for clarity. For purposes of references, it's 0872 001 0023, and it'll be item 105 I want identified. Have you got that on the screen in front of you?
105, wasn't it?
Sorry, brother, have you got it?
Is it 105?
Yes. I'll read it for clarity. He says, firstly, 2%, that's 1 in 50, 2% of Catholic clergy throughout the world have been deemed guilty of sexual abuse against children. And later on, he says that's a figure released by the Vatican. You may recall Councillor Sisting, at the commencement of this hearing, stated that based on information received from Catholic Church authorities between 1980 and 2015, 281 Christian brothers were subject to one or more claims of substantiated complaints of child sexual abuse. So those are the figures that we have before us. One is a Vatican figure of, in general, 1 in 50, and counsel assisting 281 Christian brothers. Now, I don't have before me the figure of, in general, 1 in 50, and counsel assisting become members of the order in Australia. But it looks to me as if 281 is a far higher figure than the 1 in 50 from the Vatican. And perhaps you could tell me what, roughly speaking, it would represent. But the question in my mind, and this question before the Commission, is why would there be a much higher percentage of offenders in the Christian Brothers than is generally reported by the Vatican? You are a senior and very experienced Christian brother, so perhaps you can assist us with that.
Brother, you may need, in order to help us understand your answer, do you know how many Christian brothers were there in 1980 in Australia?
In 1980,
Yeah.
about between 350 and 400.
Right. And in 2015, how many?
2015, about 300.
300, that's in Australia, or is that in Oceania?
Well, that's Oceania. For Australia, let's say 230, something like that.
Right. So those who've been convicted, the great bulk of those convictions would be of brothers who were brothers in 1980, wouldn't they?
Of those who've been convicted, yes.
Right. Because,
Yes.
because of the age profile, the need for training and so on.
Yes,
So
certainly.
the comparator is something like the total number convicted against the total number who may have been brothers in 1980. Against the total number who may have been brothers in 1980.
Brother Brandon, I've got 3 figures in my mind. One is convictions, one is claims, and one is substantiated complaints. The Catholic Church authorities have provided us with a figure of 281. It seems that without trying to get to an exact comparator, that is much higher, and perhaps you could figure of 281. It seems that without trying to get to an exact and I want to understand why it would be so much higher.
Well, the short answer is I don't know, but let me make a couple of comments that probably bear on that in some way. Let me make a couple of comments that probably bear on that. The statistics around the number of brothers are difficult for us even to establish, because we've had people who join us and stay for 1 year and then disappear, and people who stay for 2 years and disappear, etc. So if we go back to the 1950s or the 60s or wherever and try and count brothers and try and capture the history of the former provinces that existed, we haven't been able actually to do the sums to put together our own history to say what the total number of brothers has been.
But that doesn't answer the question. The question I want from you, answer from you, if you're able to give it, and you may not be able to, is why?
All right, but what I'm trying to get at is I don't know what the percentage in terms of the brothers actually is. All right, but what I'm trying to get at is I don't know what the percentage...
Get at least a feeling from you. Do you think it's greater than 1 in 50 as put down by the Vatican? The Vatican says, according to Dr. Evans, 2% of Catholic clergy throughout the world have been deemed guilty. That's the use the word deemed, not found. And those figures are from the Vatican. It seems to me on the face of it, the 281 figure provided to us by Catholic authorities would be a higher percentage than that.
Well, I don't know how much faith to put in the 2% figure. That'd be my first comment.
So you're saying the Pope's wrong?
I'm just saying I don't know how much faith to put in it. One of the things I'd say about the brothers...
Saying the Pope's wrong?
I'm just saying I don't know how much faith to put in it. The Christian Brothers had vastly bigger numbers of schools and communities across the country than any other men's religious order. The Marist Brothers and the De La Salle Brothers and so on. We had communities right across Queensland, West Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and so on. So the numbers were quite vast. And that, just in terms of global numbers, has given us big numbers. That's one fact. Another thing I'd say that contributes to not so much the numbers, but to the problem, if I can just touch on that, it was touched on by Brother Nangle yesterday, and it is relevant in a way, is that, if I can just touch on that, it was touched on by Brother Nangle yesterday, and a notion that we ought to be out and about recruiting young people to the Brotherhood. And that exercise was undertaken very vigorously. And young people were recruited. And I think young, generous, well-motivated people were recruited at a time in their lives where the future was bright, etc. And they went into training colleges, etc. Many of those young people were actually not suitable at all. They were not filtered out when they should have been. They perhaps even in some instances felt trapped in a culture that wasn't for them. They didn't understand ways of sort of moving out of that sort of situation that they were in. So I think recruitment processes and encouragement and all of that was a massive mistake, the way it was undertaken. The second thing that went wrong in relation to all of that was the inadequacy of formation processes. And and I could go into that in terms of more detail, which I won't do because you're talking more about numbers. But the recruitment side of it has got something to do with the numbers. And that brought vast numbers into our congregation around the 50s and 60s. And those people, many of those people who shouldn't have been there at all, or should have been moved out of the scene remained there and became part of these statistics, which in the long run generated higher numbers in a statistical sense than might have been normative. That's a long-winded way of giving some sort of response, I think, to that. So I can't give you a statistical response, but that's a bit of a descriptive response. I hope that's helpful.
Brother, with all of those factors in play, the fundamental position is that the Christian Brothers ran a great many schools.
Sorry.
With all of those factors in play, the fundamental position is the Christian Brothers have run a great many schools.
Yes.
Including boarding schools.
Yes.
And without the proper people and the proper rules to manage those institutions, people who wanted to offend had access to children, didn't they?
I think that's true.
And in fact, I'm sure you would accept that the Christian Brothers had not put in place appropriate management processes in all of their institutions to ensure the safety of the children.
It did not happen in all of the institutions anyway, yes.
Sorry?
It did not happen universally across those institutions.
That's right. Yes, Mr. Freed.
Nothing further, Your Honour.
Very well. Thank you, brother. That concludes your evidence. You're excused.
Thank you.
Where do we go from there, Mr. Freed?
Your Honour, I had very much hoped we would reach Dr. Evans this afternoon. He's been waiting most of the day, but I see it's got very late.
It's too late now.
Yes.
So where do we go?
If there is the opportunity for an early start in the morning, I understand arrangements have been made.
Well, I understand that the proposal was we would start at 9:30.
Yes, Your Honour.
With the evidence of Bishop Noel Kearns. Is that still the?
Yes, if we could still start at 9:30, Your Honour, we'll need to speak to the respective witnesses, and it may be that we deal with Dr. Evans first. He won't take very long, I expect, but.
Well, if arrangements have been put in place, we need to tell everyone now what time we're starting tomorrow. Are we starting at 9:30? Is the question.
Well, yes, certainly. I take up
All
the
right.
9:30 invitation, Your Honour.
We'll start at 9:30.
Thank you.